Hello, my name is Ellen Harris, and I'm happy to spend a little bit of time talking about this wonderful concert of Handel Cantatas that's being presented by the Boston Early Music Festival with Amanda Forsyth and Stephen Stubbs. I also want to say a few words about Handel as Orpheus, which is a book I wrote 20 years ago on Handel's cantatas. Steve asked if he could give the name also to the concert, and I'm most grateful for that. When Handel arrived in Italy in 1706, he was 21. He had already had a huge success with his opera Armida in Hamburg. And so he already came to Italy known to some. He certainly was known to the Medici. And I think that his fame spread far and wide rather quickly. Um, he was in Italy for about 4 years. He wrote two operas, two oratorios, and more than 100 cantatas. His operas are the opera Rodrigo in 1707 that he wrote for the Florentine court, which was commissioned by Prince Ferdinand de' Medici. And then his second opera was Agrippina, which he wrote for Venice. It was performed in the San Crisostomo Theater, which was owned by the Grimani. And in fact, his libretto was written by Cardinal Grimani, whom he probably had met in Naples the year before. So even that concert in a public theater had an aristocratic basis and may have been sponsored by the Grimani family. He wrote his oratorios for Rome, where opera at the time was prohibited. So he wrote Il trionfo del tempo e del disinganno for Cardinal Pamphilj, 1707, and he wrote La Resurrezione in 1708 for Prince Ruspoli. And he wrote the big serenata Aci Galatea e Polifemo for Naples for the wedding of the Duke d'Alvito, which was commissioned by the bride's aunt, the Duchess Aurora Sanseverino. So you sort of see a network of patronage across most of the boot of Italy, from Florence to Venice to Rome to Naples. And Handel wrote cantatas in all of those places. We have most of our information from Rome, where he wrote cantatas for Prince Ruspoli, for the Cardinal Pamphili, also for the Cardinal Ottoboni, and he wrote religious music for the Cardinal Colonna. He wrote cantatas in Florence for the Medici and maybe for the Grimani or others in Venice. And of course, he wrote cantatas when he was in Naples for the wedding of the Duke d'Alvito. So, cantatas in all those places. There are about, as I said, somewhat more than 100 cantatas, and you can divide them into two groups. One group is called instrumental cantatas, and they have treble instrumental lines for violin or some other treble instrument, in addition to the vocal line and the continual line. They themselves can be divided into two parts, whether they are written for women's voices or men's voices. The women's voices are almost all abandoned women and are depictions of women in extremis and are very operatic in the sense that the women are all speaking in first person, and so could become sort of part of an operatic scene if there was such an opera. The men's cantatas, in contrast, are typically narrations. They're stories that are being told about King Abdolonimus or about Daedalus and Icarus, which will come up again later. So they are not operatic in the same sense and are more controlled musically. They're not any less passionate. They're very deep, beautiful arias, but they don't have the same first-person experience that you get in the abandoned women cantatas. The continual cantatas are pastoral in nature and do not have characters. So whereas the women are Lucrezia or Armida or Agrippina or Hero, and the men are, say, Daedalus and Icarus, in the pastoral cantatas, we have a whole bunch of anonymous. There's Chloe and Tirce and Phileno, and so it goes. Although sometimes there is a real sense that behind those names, there are people who were at the musicals, or conversazione, as they were called, in these aristocratic homes where the cantatas were performed, and that the cantatas actually have an identity, that they talk about individual people in the room. Some of that can be told and is very obvious and on the surface, and some of it is much more hidden. Um, I think at this point, really, it would be a good idea to share some things with you. I'm going to share my screen so that we can look at a few things together as we think about the music of the cantatas that are going to be performed in the concert. I think it's one of the advantages potentially of Zoom lectures is that I can show you things I would never dare show you if we were in a room together and you were 10 or 20 rows away, because you'd never be able to see it. But I'm hoping that we can sort of lean in together and enjoy some of these things, and we'll give you a way of listening to some special moments in the wonderful repertoire that we're going to hear performed. So I'm going to share my screen, and there is the very beginning of the cantata Armida Abbandonata. And Armida was written by Handel in 1707 in Rome, probably for Prince Ruspoli. And I love looking at autographs because it really does give you the sense that every decision is a choice and that nothing is coming to you prepackaged, although sometimes it feels that way when we listen to, wonderful performances or listen to recordings over and over again. It seems to be as if it could never be otherwise, and of course everything could be otherwise because these are individual human choices. And here is Handel writing this out himself. And this is a narrative beginning to the Armida cantata, where she is described, is that she is running after her warrior, the Theseus, and we have her running. We have the 16th notes going very, very quickly, and we get so far, and then Handel just sort of gives up the trouble and puts in chords and then says arpeggiando, which is a wonderful shortcut. So instead of getting all these written out arpeggios of chords, suddenly one has to do that. And then senza basso, very clear without bass, which is very distinctive. It really gives a sense of Armida is without support. She's certainly without musical support, but she's without support altogether. She's quite alone. And that sense of the unsupported voice with the arpeggios running over the top gives a sense of loneliness, I think, which is very striking, and a very striking beginning to the cantata. All of these cantatas, the women's cantatas, as I've mentioned in particular, which are first-person cantatas, really give a sense of a dramatic motion, and the music supplies that. Handel works hard to give you a sense of action and place. And I think you can sort of see this as the narrator describes it. You can see her running after Theseus. You can see her giving up ultimately and realizing, it says here, that she realizes that her golden hair, that the l'oro del suo crine, her golden hair, I vezzi, her charm, I sguardi, her glances, I preghi, her prayers, none of which are going to keep him. And then we see she stops running. And then we just get these staccato chords. And ultimately, she sits down on a rock alone and crying, piangendo here, and sospirando, sighing. She said this, così disse. And then the cantata proper begins with the first aria. And here is Armida, oh, cruel one, and so you have gone, and you have left me in my sadness, duolo, and on lasci, e mi lasci, and you've left me. There's this long melisma of notes. And it's surprising, it's not on the kind of motion word that you would expect, so many long notes, but mi lasci, and I feel as if she's almost keening at this point. I mean, weeping. She's been described as weeping and sighing, and this run, and then the staccato notes over this run, that we're in 16th notes here, we're 32nd notes here. It's an extraordinary long melisma of notes, which is very striking and is another scene setting moment for the cantata where we hear her voice for the first time. Note also later in the aria when she says, "Don't you realize that you only are my delight?" So tu solo, you only, and we have tu solo and then a rest through the whole score, tu solo solo, a rest through the score, and por sai, that don't you know, rest through the score, che lei tu solo, that you only, rest through the score. Those silences also, those breaks after the word only, really gives you a sense, again, there's no one else there. It's just silence. She's been left in silence. There's no one with her. And he's sailing away. And she's abandoned on the shore. I want to play you just the very beginning of this through the melisma so that you hear this. It's a beautiful recording with Ellen Hargis. This is just so, so beautiful. And, I'd like to play it all for you, but you will hear it. But I wanted to give you that start of the early first two movements, both the introduction and Armida's first aria. Agrippina is a bigger cantata. She's a very different person. She's much older. Her son has condemned her to die. She's been a woman with huge successes in her life. She's certainly not sitting on a rock and crying. She's sort of waiting for the moment. She's conducted to her death and struggling with her emotions, her anger at her son and wanting to take vengeance on him. And on the other hand, realizing that it is her son and she could not possibly do it. So we have this long scene in the middle of the cantata that I just want to show you this kind of vacillation. We can't play it because it's too long and you will get to hear it, but gives you I just want you to visualize how this works. I sort of jokingly call this the lost aria technique because none of the arias finish. You keep thinking you're going to get an aria and you don't, because she doesn't have really enough focus, enough concentration to carry any one of these arias through, and she doesn't really know her own mind at this point. And this is all part of the extremity of her situation. So she begins by singing this beautiful aria, "How, O God, can I desire the death of one I have brought into life?" And you will think that it's an aria. One of the things to listen for, you can't miss it, is this repeating tone that comes over and over again. And that is a kind of the sense of this. I mean, I'm doing this with my hands because it is the sense of this woman sitting in her cell, and this, it's almost hammering in her head, "How, oh God, can I desire the death?" And, we get it again here. "How, oh God," this single note over the top over and over again. And it's kind of obsessive. And it ends nicely here on a cadence and then just stops. And it falls into very fast recitativo secco, dry recitative that runs very quickly. And then next page, we get the next apparent aria, si succida. So she's changed her mind. Okay, all right, let's kill him. He doesn't deserve my pity, even though I'm his mother. And so kill him, succida, succida. And it also suddenly breaks down here. You can see the aria beginning to fall apart. It almost fragments. And then you get the si, as if the aria is continuing. You get succida, and then you go eki. So kill him, and then she goes, who? I'm going to kill my own progeny? So no, she can't do that either. So then we go through another recitative, and then the next aria begins. This is slower, very beautiful. She says, "I will be the only one to die. Let my death be the only death. A me soul, to me only. Giunga la morte." So this could have gone on much longer for me because it's very beautiful, but she can't sustain that as well, and falls back into, no, no, I can't. I have to take revenge in some way. Another aria, let him fall, and the music again. You can get the line, let him fall, and you can see on the page almost that with each aria, this is aria 2, aria 3, aria 4, that um, that the sections become shorter, that the vacillations become more rapid, and you can see the anxiety building in this scene. It's really quite an amazing dramatic scene. Falls again into recitative, and then goes back to Come Odio. Um, I would love to know what text Handel was actually handed. I almost have the feeling that what Handel is doing here is trying to give it a semblance of a da capo aria. Not that it is; it's not a da capo aria, but this feeling that there is a return. And then finally, you go to this recitative, which there's been a volte-face, right? Because instead of Sisi suicida, yes, yes, kill him, we now have yes, yes, vive Nerone, yes, yes, let Nerone live. So extraordinary musical setup where you have to go, from style to style to style. It is, I'm sure, difficult for the composer, difficult for the singer to be able to do this kind of vacillation. And I hope that by looking at this, you have a sense of this when it comes to you, when you hear it, um, when it's actually performed by Amanda Forsyth. This gives you a little sense of it. I can play this for you. It's an aria that follows that big scene. And I mean, I love it because here you have a formal da capo aria, but still this kind of vacillation of tempo and style in the aria itself. Say Infelice al Mondo is in slow tempo in 4/4. Then the B section begins, but I'm going to take vengeance. We have vendetta, vendetta, which is allegro, again in 4/4. But then when she talks about coming back as a shade, as a ghost, with the bacchante to basically make his life miserable, it changes back to an andante and becomes very dark. And changes to 3/4 times. So suddenly we've moved from the 1, 2, 3, 4 to 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's a very different feel. And the shifts are very abrupt. And I can start playing it right here. So you hear the end of the A section and just hear these very quick shifts. And what's really striking is that, as I say, this is happening within a da capo. It's not even like the scene that we've had previously, which was built with the idea of the vacillations occurring, but rather a da capo aria. And allegro. One, two, three. That's the A section again. I'm going to leave it at that. I really have the sense in this Andante section of menace when she talks about the black shades and the bacchantes in the 3/4 time. But again, that vacillation, she cannot really maintain a single style in the conditions she's in and in the extreme emotion that she is feeling. When we get to the continuo cantata, Sare Tropo Felice, we get to Pamphili. Pamphili was the author of that, and he was 54 when Handel arrived in Rome, and Handel was 21, and this is approximately what the two men looked like at that point. If we look at the text that Pamphili wrote for Handel, we can find a story, which I don't think is terribly submerged. One of the first cantata that he wrote, Handel non può mia musa, he writes, Handel, my muse, it cannot keep up with yours, but you force me into song, and then there is an aria about music. And then we get this recitative line, which is, so you, greater than Orpheus, forced my muse into song after the plectrum was hung on an ancient tree and lay motionless. Now, that is a musical metaphor, to be sure, but I think there is a sexual metaphor that is not very subtle, which is equally important to this. I think that Pamphili had fallen head over heels in love with Handel when he arrived in Rome in early 1707. In fact, in the next big text he wrote, the oratorio Il Trionfo del Tempo e del Disinganno, Pamphili puts Handel into the oratorio, makes a character, makes him a person who exists in pleasure's palace, and as one of the things in the palace that needs to be discarded before one can reach salvation. These are the things one may not have. And Handel is in the palace of pleasure as an organist who plays a beautiful organ concerto, basically for the soul, who is being shown the palace by pleasure, who is trying to convince the soul that this is a place to reside. But she is disabused of that notion by truth and by Disinganno, who is undeceit. And Pamphili writes at this juncture, when describing Handel, the musician who's going to play the organ concerto, as a graceful young man who arouses great delight in alluring sounds. I do think this put Handel into an awkward situation, is not only to be described this way, to end up in one of the works that he was actually composing and then leading from the keyboard, but also having to set to music or to compose an organ concerto, which was something that has to be discarded. I don't think Handel ever felt that way about his music. And indeed, when he went to England and then revived this work in the 1730s, he very deliberately took himself out of it. He made the musician that had to be discarded in Pleasure's Palace his concertmaster instead, which removed him from that awkward position. And then when he revived the work again in the 1750s, he removed the entire scene. So the discomfort of this was very clear to him, and something that he did not want as part of this work when it was shown to his London audiences. But Pamphili was not the only person who was attracted to Handel. Handel also apparently had to deal with the singer Vittorio Tarquini, who it is said fell in love with him. And they are rumored to have had an affair. So in July, the next cantata, or the next text that Pamphili writes for Handel, is this text, which title is The Warning. And this begins and ends with a cantata that describes moths being attracted to a flame, tra le fiamme, among the flames, and that all the moths will die and only the phoenix will survive. Well, Phoenix was Pamphili's pen name with the Arcadian Academy in Rome, and so he's clearly referring to himself. And there is very little doubt in my mind that he is saying to Handel here, look, of all the people attracted to this flame, you are a moth and you will die, and only someone like me, the phoenix, could survive something like that. But you cannot. And then he goes on to narrate the story of Daedalus and Icarus, a Daedalus who makes wings for himself and his son, and warns his son not to fly too near the sun because of the wax, but his son cannot resist flying too near the sun. That is basically like a moth to the flame, and the wax melts and the son plunges to his death in the sea. And as this story is told, we get this recitative: in foolish flight, Icaruses are many, Daedalus only one. And I think that there is a story here about patronage. It could refer to Pamphilj, with Pamphilj saying to Handel, look, there are many artists and musicians, and I can have any one of them, but there's only one of me, so be careful. It could also refer to Prince Ferdinando de' Medici. It could be a warning about him, which is the same thing. Look, Prince Ferdinand de' Medici can have anyone he wants as one of his musicians, but there's only one Ferdinando. You really shouldn't play with fire, tra le fiamme. But it could also refer to a romantic relationship, which is basically Pamphilj saying, I can have anyone I want, but there's only one of me. And don't forget that either. So I just find this line remarkable in its resonance, and that the title is called The Warning. And Pamphilj owned a wonderful painting of Daedalus and Icarus, which I think may have played a role in his writing of this cantata. But then we get to Sarei Tropo Felice, which is in now September. And this is a cantata that is bound by this refrain, I would be so happy if I could give laws to my thoughts. And so the idea of control, and this has always been the masculine ideal, as opposed to women's vacillation and instability that one sees in the abandoned women's cantatas. Men in situation of great adversity frequently are very controlled, or at least they're supposed to be. And the line "Vincer se stessa è la maggiore vittoria," which is the victory over oneself is the best victory, was actually the title of Handel's first Italian libretto. We call it Rodrigo because it's easier, but it was actually "Vincer se stesso è la maggiore vittoria." And in fact, many of Handel's opera characters later in London say essentially that line at some point, like Orlando does after he goes mad and then recovers his mind. He says the victory over oneself, and Alessandro talks about victory over oneself, and Scipione, the victory over oneself is the best victory. They're all saying this because this is the masculine ideal, and it's the difference between the abandoned women. We don't get any abandoned men vacillating, unstable cantatas the way we do for the women. And so there's a very strong feeling in this cantata of trying to gain control, and it does so with a refrain. There is a refrain that begins the recitative, ends the first recitative, ends the second recitative, and ends the cantata. The cantata ends with a recitative with the refrain at the end. The singer at one point refers to herself as Clori and says, Clori betrayed Clori, Clori Sciornita Clori. But it's a line that doesn't connect to any other line, and you could easily substitute Tirsi if you wanted to, or Pamphilj could be writing in a woman's voice, the way Lawrence Lipking talks about abandoned women and the poetic tradition, and how all poets have at some time or another written something in the voice of a woman, and that has often had enormous impact on other things they have done, I suspect. We have other cantatas by Pamphilj in which he's writing in the voice of a woman, and I have, in fact, also called Clori, which is of interest. So I suspect this is in Pamphilji's voice, and he is saying, I wish I could give laws to my thoughts. And I suspect his thoughts are about Handel when he is talking about an unhappy relationship, because the relationship with Handel doesn't pan out for him. So it is an extraordinary cantata, again, one very tightly connected to Handel and to Pamphilj, and performed at Verspes Palazzo Bonelli. So you wonder what the audience thought, but I think this happened more often than not, and intriguing to listen to today for both its biographical and its musical meaning. The Trio Sonata in F, which is my favorite Trio Sonata from Italy, um, is going to be performed, which I'm very happy about. And I did want to show you this copy of it that was written out by Johann Joachim Quantz in Dresden in about 1720, so 10 or 15 years after Handel wrote it. And it does give a sense of how Handel's music circulated at this time, that Handel was a very well-known composer um, early in his life, in fact. Um, and we see that Quantz identifies Handel as Monsieur Handel, which I really like. This is the first movement. Um, and the second movement begins here. The second movement is, I confess, my favorite. And it's a fugue. It has a wonderful fugue subject, which has 3 motives in it. The first is this repeated note. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. And then the syncopated motive, bum, ba, da, dum, ba, da, dim, ba, da, dum, ba, da, dum, ba, dum. And then the 16th notes, da, dee, da, 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 dee, da, 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 dee, da, 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 dee, da, da, and so forth. I mean, I've said in the past about this that it feels to me like children playing, maybe playing Keep Away. There's this sort of na 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 about the repeated note, and then maybe Keep Away with the syncopated dum da da dim ba da dim ba. You can sort of imagine them jumping away from one another and then running da di da 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 dim with the 16th notes. So this wonderful fugue with these 3 motives, you can hear it in all the voices. Here it is in the second violin, comes in the first violin, comes in the cello, and then, you know, again in the cello, second violin, first violin. I mean, it's, and the motives play so wonderfully with one another that it is great fun listening to it. But as you proceed through it, suddenly on this page, you get this chromatic descent in the violins, with a chromatic also in the bass, and it comes out of nowhere. It matches nothing that's gone on before. It's a real shock, and it's a real almost brutal juxtaposition of style. And then, as if nothing happened, the fugue subject begins again. And I always go, what has happened here? And then later, even worse, the thing just breaks off. It stops suddenly. There's no warning. You almost fall into a pit, and there's silence, a rest for a measure with a fermata over it, and then a very slow, almost solemn conclusion. I feel very strongly that this movement, in fact, the whole Trio Sonata, could be an accompaniment for a video. I mean, for me, I do hear children playing, but then there's very worrisome moments, the chromatic moment, the silence moment, what has happened, what would happen in the video if that was, my plan for making something visual. I think you may visualize something yourself when you hear this movement, but you certainly don't need to, because it's musically structured in a beautiful way, and you can simply follow the musical structure. If you have any ideas about a great video to go along with this, you can drop me a line, let me know. I wish we could speak to one another at the interval. And finally, we get to the Arya col Parteer, which is part of the cantata Anche purtroppo è vero, for which is a continuo cantata, but Stephen Stubbs has written 2 violin parts, making it into a trio sonata accompaniment. It's very, very beautiful. And I wanted to show you how Handel did this, because Steve is actually following Handel's model. And here we have a cantata dolce pure d'amore lafano, which is a continuo cantata, and it goes dolce pure d'amor lafano. And then in 1735 in Alcina, so, almost 30 years later, we get this aria for Alcina at a much higher pitch, but I'll stay where I just sang it. Di cor mio quanto t'amai. Now, we notice that the introduction to the continuo cantata is a bass line, which is unrelated to the song, to the vocal line. This is very common of Handel, that you have a contrapuntal um, situation between the vocal line and the bass line. You only have two lines after all. And there is a contrapuntal setup where they're playing different things and complementing one another. What Handel does in Alcina is take the melody, ya da da dee da da dee, and moves it from where the singer starts back to the beginning, where the bass line is the same, and harmonizes it for second violin and viola. So he has a three-part texture over the bass, but this is in fact the tune, da 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 dee da da dee da dee da, and then you get the singer to sing it. A very simple way of creating an instrumental texture where in the cantata there was none. And in fact, that's what Steve has done in Cold Parteer, where you have this wonderful dotted bass, which gives you the sense of agitation in the aria, and then the lament is in the vocal line, since the departure of the beautiful, beautiful Chloe. My life has changed, basically. And Steve is able to take this vocal line and move it back here for the violins, can play it with the bass before the singer comes in. And he uses this technique throughout to create ritornelli now that have trio sonata texture rather than just continuo. Let me play for you what this sounds like in Handel's version. And this is again sung by Ellen Hargis. That just gives you the little tidbit of an idea, because you will love it in Steve's version. And I think I will leave it there with the idea of Stephen Stubbs becoming Handel. I'm looking forward to this repertoire enormously, and I hope you enjoy it. I can't imagine you won't. Um, the music that Handel wrote in Italy is some of the most beautiful he ever wrote, which is astonishing given he was such a young man. But of course, it served him well because he used a lot of this music later in his life when he was writing his operas and his oratorios. So please do enjoy, and I hope to see you soon at a live concert.